Welcome to the Sense Making in a Changing World podcast, where we explore the kind of thinking we need to navigate a positive way forward. I'm your host, Morag, permaculture educator and global ambassador, filmmaker, eco-villager, food forester, mother, practivist, and all-round lover of thinking, communicating, and acting regeneratively. For a long time, it's been clear to me that to shift trajectory to a thriving one planet way of life, we first need to shift our thinking. The way we perceive ourselves in relation to nature, self, and community is the core. So this is true now more than ever, and even the way change is changing. Unprecedented changes are happening all around us at a rapid pace. So how do we make sense of this? To know which way to turn, to know what action to focus on, so our efforts are worthwhile and nourishing and are working towards resilience, regeneration, and reconnection. What better way to make sense than to join together with others in open, generative conversation? In this podcast, I'll share conversations with my friends and colleagues, people who inspire and challenge me in their ways of thinking, connecting, and acting. These wonderful people are thinkers, doers, activists, scholars, writers, leaders, farmers, educators, people whose work informs permaculture and spark the imagination of what a post-COVID, climate-resilient, socially just future could look like. Their ideas and projects help us to make sense in this changing world, to compost and digest the ideas, and to nurture the fertile ground for new ideas, connections, and actions. Together we'll open up conversations in the world of permaculture design, regenerative thinking, community action, earth repair, eco-literacy, and much more. I can't wait to share these conversations with you. Over the last 3 decades of personally making sense of the multiple crises we face, I always return to the practical and positive world of permaculture, with its ethics of earth care, people care, and fair share. I've seen firsthand how adaptable and responsive it can be in all contexts, from urban to rural, from refugee camps to suburbs. It helps people make sense of what's happening around them and to learn accessible design tools to shape their habitat positively and to contribute to cultural and ecological regeneration. This is why I've created the Permaculture Educators program, to help thousands of people to become permaculture teachers everywhere through an interactive online dual certificate of permaculture design and teaching. We sponsor global perma-youth programs, women's self-help groups in the global south, and teens in refugee camps. So anyway, this podcast is sponsored by the Permaculture Education Institute and our Permaculture Educators program. If you'd like to find more about permaculture, I've created a 4-part permaculture video series to explain what permaculture is and also how you can make it your livelihood as well as your way of life. We'd love to invite you to join our wonderfully inspiring, friendly and supportive global learning community. So I welcome you to share each of these conversations, and I'd also like to suggest you create a local conversation circle to explore the ideas shared in each show and discuss together how this makes sense in your local community and environment. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet and speak with you today, the Gubbi Gubbi people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In this episode of Sense Making in a Changing World, I'm joined by best-selling author and educator Claire Dunn, who currently resides in Naarm Melbourne on Wurundjeri country. Back in 2014, she released a book, My Year Without Matches, sharing a personal story of her year on a wilderness survival program and the profound shift she experienced as she rewilded her existence, her way of thinking, and her body. Now, back in the city that has been in lockdown for almost 12 months throughout this COVID period, Claire opens a new conversation, that of how to rewild your life right where you are. There's wilderness everywhere, inside and out, she says. Her new book, released in June, called Rewilding the Urban Soul, Searching for the Wilds in the City, is a conversation about this. I hadn't seen Claire for a couple of years, so it's been great to reconnect. I hope you enjoyed this conversation, dropping in on our chat about rewilding. Welcome to the show, Claire. It's absolutely fantastic to have you here to explore, many things, but one of them being the release of your new book not that long ago. Congratulations. So your new book is called Rewilding the Urban Soul, which I can just feel this beautiful, deep thinking around connection with where we are, what we have, which is such an important message now. But it is a difference from your previous one, which was sort of going out into the wilds, and this one is sort of saying embrace the wilds where you are. So maybe just if you could introduce your current book and perhaps a little bit of the journey in between the previous one in, was it 2014? Was it?
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Sure.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's really great to be chatting with you, Morag, and picturing your beautiful land up there. And here I am in Melbourne in lockdown on the banks of the Yarra on Wurundjeri country. And yes, so this rewilding of the urban soul is what I've been exploring and experimenting with for the last, well, pretty much 6 years since I moved back to the city. And the experiment really has been, it came from a deep need in myself. I found myself living back in the city again, which was not planned. I always thought that I'd live out in the bush, in the country, grew up on the country and ended up in the city, and thought, well, I've got two choices here. I can either kind of shut down the deep connections that I've been developing and cultivating with the more than human world, and just, put my head down and kind of live a city life, of human-centered life. Or I can see if there's some way, some bridge that I can find to enable me to connect and to belong to the more than human world where I am in the city, and to experiment with in what forms, what technologies, what practices work in this context of the city streets and of the kind of urban parklands. And so really the question is essentially around belonging. How can I kind of cultivate a sense of belonging where I am, which for me is much easier when I'm in a kind of a naturally dominated landscape. But when I'm in a human-dominated landscape, the question really sharpens and deepens. And it's taken me on quite a journey these last 6 years. And yeah, as you referenced, it's a far cry from the book I wrote in 2014, that came out in 2014, My Year Without Matches, which talks about a year that I spent out in the wilds, really immersing myself in the more than human world and apprenticing myself to earth skills. And then here I find myself in the city. So the question's kind of the same. It's just the context and the landscape's very different.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a particularly important message as we find ourselves today very localized. Surprisingly, like if we had this conversation 2 years ago, I think it would be very different, wouldn't it? Because we now find ourselves in this situation where we are in a place.
That's right.
Needing to think quite differently about it. And there was something that you wrote, or that I read somewhere about the work that you're doing, which is something that you describe as the wilderness is all around and in you. And I love that thinking about it. It's like, rather than that thinking that, well, nature's out there and nature's the other, that we are nature, and the wild spaces are not just external to us or external even to the city, but they are everywhere, absolutely everywhere.
Yes.
So can you talk a little bit about that inner and outer world?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is, when I went into my bush experience, it was all about, how do I connect with the elements and the wilder world. And of course, what started to happen in that process of deep immersion is really uncovering the kind of wilds within, which is, the bulk of our kind of psyches, the mysteries that, that live within us, and the kind of deep relationship and communication that happens between the outer and the inner. And so the question for me has really deepened into this sense of what is wildness, and this word wild, which actually really means self-will, that comes from a kind of a meaning of self-will, this kind of idea of a sovereign being. So wildness actually coming from our sovereignty, from our sense of our wholeness, our sense of our essence. And wildness as a quality, our sense of, when I say wildness, I mean a sense of being at home in our bodies and at home on the land, at home in our emotions, that sense of like all is welcome, that this human has such a range, a spectrum of expression of emotionality, and a kind of rich dream world and symbolic world, and a kind of physicality and sensuality with the more than human world. And this quality of our wildness, or our kind of our inherent belonging, our inherent indigeneity to the earth, our terrestrial indigeneity, this is something that has been so systematically suppressed in Western culture. It's one of our qualities of wholeness that has been really heavily dampened. And the repercussions of that are serious. The repercussions of that are certainly a loss of wholeness, a loss of sense of sovereignty, a loss of aliveness, a loss of a connection to our gifts, and a loss of a kind of language of the soul. And so reclaiming our wildness, reclaiming our inherent belonging, reclaiming our belonging to our bodies, to our emotions, to the earth, this is really what I've been exploring. And that can happen anywhere, because we are wild nature. And so put us in a city environment, and it takes a little bit more effort, or a little bit more awareness, or a kind of attunement to kind of cultivate the wildness, to remember the wildness, but it's always available. And so it's that quality of our inherent belonging that this kind of question of connection has been whittled down to, in a way, which is great news for most of us who live in the city, because most Australians, and we're a very urbanized nation. So if we can't access that where we live, then we're in trouble, because wildness really feels to me like a key. Reclaiming our wildness feels like a key to the kind of restoring balance and health to our culture and our planet.
You talk about healing quite a lot, and I guess from what you just said then, is it's on many scales. It's not just about healing our bodies, it's about how we are in our world, and the healing of the planet, the healing of communities, healing of our food systems, healing in many different ways. And do you want to maybe talk a little bit about your healing journey, or where you see the importance of this healing process through reconnection?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, this whole inquiry, of course, started with a deep, burning personal question. And when I was in my 20s, I was an environmental campaigner for the Wilderness Society and other organisations, and pouring my energy into kind of saving forests and conservation work, which was wonderful and enlivening, but also it gave me such a clear understanding that the deeper problem, the root cause of the ecological crisis, is our culture's deep separation and disconnection certainly from the natural world, but also from our own sense of wholeness, our own sense of wildness, our own sense of innate belonging. And then, of course, I realized that I have that wound as well. I've grown up in this Western culture, and I too hold the wound of disconnection and separation. And so part of my healing journey was the decision to go into the bush for 12 months and to really turn my attention to healing this wound in myself. And of course, in the healing of the wound, what it did was flush up waves of kind of grief, of cultural grief and personal grief around realizing how disconnected not just myself, but the culture that I was embedded in had become, and how much that I had been conditioned into this kind of productivity mindset, and worth coming from what we do, and a very kind of, rational-minded Western linear thinking model. So it was a kind of healing journey that really was fostered by being immersed in wild nature that is constantly in flow. It's just constantly being itself. It's constantly in flow, and immersed in that, steeped in that, it started to kind of work on me in that same way. And it was a very painful but necessary kind of shedding of that old conditioning, and a kind of re-emergence of a more fluid, more receptive, more attuned, more wilder way of being.
I wonder, in all your exploration of this, how you describe where that deep disconnection comes from in our culture.
Where it comes from. Yeah, well, essentially, it's so embedded in the fabric of our cultural origins. This kind of rational, scientific, mechanistic thinking that goes back to the kind of early scientists of Newton and Aristotle, breaking things down into parts and separate parts and pieces, and ignoring the truth of the relationships between things. And it's really stemmed from that kind of understanding of the world as separate, isolated, competing pieces. And our culture has been built on that, and instead what we're seeing the resurgence of, and certainly my work really promotes this sense of how we understand ourselves in relationship again.
Yeah. And so in this urban rewilding, where do people start to begin without having that deep immersive experience that you talk about in the wild? How do we find those places in an urban context where we can feel that just becoming part of where we are and of the wild spaces, or bringing the wild in?
Yeah.
What are the things that you suggest that people do? Because I know that you run education programs, and through your book you're also talking about this. What is that reconnection process look like to you?
Well, it's like a web, and it has lots of different kind of threads to it. And it's been such a wonderful exploration, because this is the question. I didn't have the answer when I set out to kind of write this book. It was more like, well, that's right. How do we do this in the city? And one of the most kind of significant kind of teaching tools I had was this program I started with a friend called Rewilded Fridays, which was a program designed for city dwellers to come together every Friday in different city parklands and practice the kind of core routines of nature connection and nature awareness and observation and kind of learning ecological literacy. I had no idea how this program would go, how we'd go in a public park, how the group would work, whether we could actually find a way to kind of practice these hands-on skills. And what happened, Morag, over 2 years of really regular Friday meetups, and what we were doing was really simple practices. We were finding sit spots and practicing nature observation and awareness. We were learning the language of the birds. We were just wandering, using our kind of opening up all our senses. That was a big part of it, was really, really opening our senses to what's really happening around us. And practicing earth skills like fire and water filters and string making and pottery and all the skills of long-term kind of earth living. And of course, the other layer was building community, building safety, building community, building relationships in the human world. And what started to happen over this 2 years quite quickly and quite efficiently was that people who had very little or no ecological knowledge started to develop strong relationships with these areas that we were dwelling in. They started to find their own sit spots at home. They started to bring the sit spot stories back to the group. The group started to weave together in a way that the learning journey kind of started to just happen by itself through the kind of regular, consistent practicing of literally just stillness, sensory opening, curiosity, awareness, storytelling, story catching, and skillful questioning. And through this really simple kind of rinse and repeat practice week after week, these people not only started to develop deep empathy and joy and kind of a childlike wonder, but also started to really kind of change other parts of their life. So, for instance, one of the participants was an osteopath, and he started reporting that his sensitivity during his sessions was much greater, just through a weekly nature connection practice. Other people started to kind of change their careers, change their jobs, and really start to their gifts, their natural gifts started to just emerge. And that was so heartening for me to see that this can happen in the city. It can happen just through regular practice and through community. And that was one of the kind of elements that really popped out at me during this urban experiment, was how key a sense of community and village is for this whole question of belonging. Of course, but as soon as we start breaking down the kind of nuclear family model and actually start weaving a kind of intentional community structure in the city suburbs, and it's easier in some ways because we're living so close together, we can easily gather. Transport's easy, it facilitates gatherings really quite easily. And if we layer that with nature connection practices, with ceremony, then we start really seeing the kind of belonging markers really going up.
I'm going to jump in here because there's so many things you've just said that I'd really love to pick up on. And one of those being your talk about practice, and it's something that I'm hearing coming up so much more. It's about this more spacious way of being, rather than saying, okay, come and just do a workshop on something or just do this one thing, or it's that longer term. It's that slowing down and giving that time and space for that reconnection to happen. And like you're saying, that rinse and repeat, it's the practice. It's just coming back to it. It's never the same each time, but you come back to it and the relationships form and develop. And this idea that community doesn't have to be necessarily like here where we are in an eco-village, and even here in an eco-village, like my community is not just the people who live here. It's like you're saying, it's the people that you're in relationship with. And so that, I think, is a really important part of what you're talking about is finding ways to connect. And I love the fact that it doesn't require anything except you just turning up.
Yep.
Showing up and being there. That, you don't need to start up a project or a community garden, which is another way of doing it. And that's been a really successful way in many communities I've been involved in. But this is simpler. This is just being there and finding a sit spot. So I wanted to ask you about how you suggest people find a sit spot that feels important to them, but then also pick up on the very last thing that you said just before I jumped in, which was about ceremony and how you grow ceremony with meaning and integrity rather than it just being kind of like a thing.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean, definitely. Such great points there, Morag. And absolutely, there's something that is so valuable about the consistency and the regularity of a community practice. It's just like going to a yoga class week after week. You get together, you practice nature connection, and catching each other's story, and things happen far greater than if you go and have a peak experience out in some wild part of the world, which is just ecstatic for that week. And then how do you integrate that? And this is more and more what I'm interested in, is the kind of value of a kind of humble kind of consistent practice where we are, where we live. And for me, my sit spot has been, my own kind of personal practice of that. It's just in my backyard. My backyard happens to back onto a river, which I'm really grateful for. But I have, over the years of sitting in that place week after week, and bringing, it's not just about nature observation. I'm also bringing whatever I am sitting, the questions that I'm sitting with in my life. I bring these questions to this sit spot, because over time this becomes a sacred spot. It's where I go without my phone. It's where I go for deep listening, deep quiet, and essentially that's a spiritual practice. It's a deep listening to self and other, and self in relationship to other.
Do you have a practice that you do? Like, is there a kind of a ritual that you do when you're there, or you just go and sit and you're just there? What is
it's literally to just go and sit. And sometimes I feel like I just like plonk myself like catch up with myself. But there's a sense of, the few minutes that it takes to walk down there, I'm really aware I'm not with my phone. I slow down. My sit spot starts at the back door when I leave. And like I open my senses. It's just in an instant, just intentionally, what's the quietest sound I can hear in each direction, what's happening around me. And just the act of that slow 5-minute walk prepares me for the sitting, even if it's just 20 minutes. It's a lot can happen in that time. And the beauty of coming to know a place, coming to know the patterns of one place, coming to know the patterns of like one family of ducks or lorikeets, it's so it's such a powerful belonging practice. So in terms of your question of how do people find a sit spot, well, the kind of general guideline is to find somewhere that's within 5 or 10 minutes walk of your home, so that you go there. So that anywhere that feels like sense of wildishness, that could just be a public park, and finding a place that just feels good, that you want to go and sit, and leaving your phone behind or putting it on flight mode, and really intentionally making that time about deep listening. Really opening up this sense of smell and touch and taste and hearing and vision. Like how much of a sponge can you be for this place if you were really receiving it? And then just really deeply listening. And it's a kind of a tracking that happens. It's a tracking moment to moment awareness of what's happening both inside of you and outside of you. And it can certainly help to keep a nature journal. It can really help to have a sit spot buddy that you swap stories with. Field guides can be really helpful. There's all sorts of extra kind of tools that you can add on to it, mapping and really kind of tracking this place over time. But essentially it's as simple as a place that feels wildish, close to your home. And just go there as often as you can, a few times a week. Sit there for, maybe 40 minutes, an hour if you have that time. And you will really, even if it's really about the quality of time in nature, not the quantity of time in nature. You could spend all day out there and not soak in nearly as much as an hour of really intentional attunement to the landscape.
And I love the idea too of the nature journal. I wonder whether you have a few prompts that you can suggest how one could start a nature journal.
Sure. Yeah. Well, if you're like me, you have resistance to, if you've done your sit spot practice, you don't want to do anymore. But I have found that even if I just tell myself I'm just going to make like a couple of notes, I might then end up writing a bit more. And the nature journal can take the place of an elder or a sit spot buddy. So you're writing in a way that incites your curiosity. So when I say, I saw 2 Pacific black ducks down on the river. Well, what am I curious about? What question can I write in my journal that kind of keeps me on the scent trail? There's always something to be curious about. The life cycles of something, the breeding cycle, the relationships between the flowering and the fruiting and the movement of plants and animals. There's always something, and the nature journal can take the place of a sit spot buddy. You can also it's a great place to make sketches, like bring up a little sprig of something, ID something, and that kind of visual representation really starts to embed it in memory. So that's a kind of quick sit spot. Yeah, and I know I haven't got to the question about ceremony yet, which I...
Oh, that's okay. We can come around there, because I actually do want to just jump in a bit to ask you about something else that you just mentioned, which was about story and sharing stories with a buddy or sharing stories with a book, or, this harvesting the stories. You are a writer and you are a storyteller. And what are some of those sorts of stories? So it kind of 2 parts to this question. I was like, what are the kind of stories that you encourage people to share, or that you find yourself naturally sharing with other people? And then how do you see or feel into what kind of stories that you end up sharing in your writing, like informed by this practice that you're talking about now?
Yeah, great question. I mean, on the kind of micro level, the storytelling about your nature connection journey, I've discovered, is just really vital. It's like the kind of, when birds just kind of companion call to each other, like they're tweeting away. It's like you do your sit spot, you tell a story, do your sit spot, you tell a story. It's like that kind of companion call. And the telling of the story, it's like a kind of, it's a form of integration, but it also incites curiosity, especially if someone's asking you really great questions. But I'm passionate about storytelling, and it gives me so much joy to kind of collect stories and then share them in a way that that really moves people. Because what I really want to do is kind of stir people into a greater love for the world, into kind of stepping outside their own comfort zones in a way to move more fully into a kind of deeper sense of belonging and love for the world. And storytelling for me is by far the most powerful medium for that. And I feel so blessed to be surrounded by so many incredible stories. And there's such a sweetness for me in the kind of harvesting of them, in the kind of taking the story and forming it into something that can be that can be read as it's like an urban myth in a way. It's like these things are happening all around us, and kind of putting the storytelling spotlight on these stories that are certainly not told in the mainstream media, of ways that people are choosing to put their attention, to put their time, to develop something that's so far from the dominant paradigm of profit building and security building, something that's far more innate, something that's far more original. And it's these kind of traditional technologies, original technologies, and how we're experimenting and playing with them, how we're learning from them, how we're kind of enlivened by them. These are the stories that I want to tell.
How do you choose which story to tell? Which ones?
There's this kind of like kill your darlings kind of understanding in book writing, which is really quite true. It feels like when I have to kind of cut out a story, I feel so gutted because they're all so precious. But, you know, they just go back into the great cauldron of stories and urban myths, and they'll come out in some other way.
Yeah. Just before we move on, what is your writing process? I'm always curious with authors. What's your writing practice for developing a book? You've got 2 books out now. The first one is a bestseller, and I haven't caught up yet with how this one's going, but I can imagine it would also be in that same genre because it's absolutely fantastic. How do you get there? How do you get to that practice of taking the time to develop such beautiful piece of work? And I'm always absolutely impressed by writers. It's my
I am too, because I don't know how people. I always say that was my last book. It's with huge resistance that I write. You know, it really feels like it is that kind of 90% perspiration, 10% inspiration. It's it takes a huge amount of discipline.
Yeah.
Because it's just an enormous amount of work. And for me, the hardest part with writing is, like, the storytelling's easy, the kind of gathering of the material is easy. It's how to kind of synthesize it in a way that is compelling, is concise, it has a narrative, the structuring of it, and the knowing what to keep and what to cull is incredibly daunting. So these books, the first book felt like it was such a trial by fire. It was such a steep learning curve of what writing a book takes. And I had dreams throughout it of, like, just births that were just interminable, these births that would just never end. But basically it was kind of excruciating at times. But the writing schedule that works for me is kind of like a 4-hour chunk in the morning. You know, and it's really that kind of discipline of switching the phone off, switching the internet off. And really I have to set myself, like, times and rewards at you know, halfway mark. I can go and get another cup of tea or whatever it is. Otherwise I just won't do it.
Yeah.
You know, there's always so many other things I could do. So it was kind of like a 9 to 1-ish chunk that I would set myself.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because it's, you know, I think it is. It's really easy to become so distracted, and that's with anything, really, isn't it? But particularly with, you know, this writing practice of crafting a story and crafting it in a way that is just so beautifully and eloquently shared that doesn't, you know, because, like you're saying, this every single moment of connection is another story.
Yes.
How to find and pick those is, yeah. So maybe we can, that was a little bit of a side question. I'm sorry for going all over the place, but maybe we can come back around to the question of ceremony now, because I think I remember talking with Satish Kumar from Schumacher College, and he was saying, you know, one of the biggest things that we forget to do is we forget to celebrate or forget to be in this sort of space of ceremony. We can live, you know, we can live a simple life, we can do all this, and sometimes we just get caught in the doingness or, you know, the slog of it, or, you know, instead of actually enjoying and celebrating the connection and creating new ways of doing that. And sometimes, I guess, coming from a place where, you know, in an eco-village or within community things, sometimes I do get a sense that ceremony can be imposed, and I become a bit resistant to that, and which is where kind of the questions come in from. So what are you finding in your community where you feel like there's this emergent celebration that happens, and what have you noticed in creating really beautiful spaces that mean something to the people that are part of it?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I've also been resistant to ceremony, but also longing for it. There's a longing for it, and I feel like it's so embedded in our bones in a way. Like all our ancestry has been steeped in ceremony, and we're in this kind of liminal space of like we don't quite know what to draw on, but we know we want techniques and tools and to mark the passing of the seasons and to mark celebrations and so I've been experimenting with kind of contemporary forms of ceremony, and really discovering how there's the thirst for them, the thirst that people have, the hunger for being in ceremonial containers. And really something that never lies is the passing of the seasons and the kind of the cycles of nature. And so that's one really powerful and easy way to bring in ceremony, because we've just passed the spring equinox. Was that yesterday or the day before? There's always, that these are the times that we can come together in celebration and in acknowledgement of seasonal change in a way that connects us both to land and community. So I know that one of the organisations here in Melbourne celebrates the return of the sacred kingfisher in November, and that's a contemporary ceremony that's come about through the changes of the landscape here and just a natural emergence of a ceremony. And something that we experimented with here at my home was a couple of years back, we held a 24-hour kind of grief ceremony over the Celtic time of Samhain, which was in Southern Hemispheres around May 1st. And part of the reason for a grief ceremony is the acknowledgement that in every culture, grieving rituals have been an integral part of village technologies. And in our culture, grief is a very kind of private activity. And a recognition that grieving together is such a connective tool. So we had this experiment of a 24-hour ceremony that was just ongoing. People could come and go as they pleased. There was some basic kind of protocols for how to be in the space, how to kind of enter in the space and relate to the fire and relate to each other. But also it was very open. And it was such a beautiful experience of community building. The people cycled through. We probably had about 150 people cycle through the backyard over 24 hours. The fire keepers came and went, and there was food shared and stories shared and tears and laughter and many stories over hours. And beautiful, surprising things like a cello turned up at midnight and started playing, and just the beauty that can be created through a simple, intentional space. So that was really enlightening for me, of what the possibilities of how culture and village can be regenerated through these forms that we make ourselves, that we see the need and we try something out. And it's not perfect. We know it's clunky. We know we're just kind of making it up as we go along. But I think the risk in not trying it out, in not initiating ceremonies is too great at this point we're in.
And I think maybe that's, my experience with community as well, is the enormous amount of confidence that a community gets and empowerment by being in a space, creating spaces where you can make something up rather than just receiving patterns that have existed before unquestioningly. Actually redefining how it is that you want to be in relation together and what kind of spaces that you want to create. And so that's hugely powerful. And I think something you just said then that I thought was really interesting was you called it a technology. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I love talking about village technologies as technologies because they're things that we've kind of either take for granted or don't kind of realize that when there's the technologies have existed for thousands and thousands of years, tried and true, and they're ways that tools, techniques that we know develop connectivity, because that's really what I'm passionate about is developing connectivity, developing belonging. And there's things that do that, like, you know, the technology of food sharing, the technology of celebrating seasonal cycles, the technology of grieving together. They're all technologies, really.
Can you just define technology then, maybe?
A way that facilitates a particular outcome that's desired, like a tool, I guess, that facilitates a particular outcome. So if we're designing a village, for connectivity, then there's certain technologies that I would suggest are really important, and regular grieving rituals, I think, would be one of them. Potluck dinners where you share sit spot stories, I think, would be another one. But again, these some of these technologies we're going to draw on from our ancestry, and some of them are going to be contemporary based on the needs that we have now.
Beautiful. And talking about food, we can't not finish this conversation without exploring food and rewilding food. I'd love to hear a bit more about how you connect with your local food in and around where you are, and both the food that you're growing but also the food that you find.
Yes. Yeah. Great question. And of course, food is something so integral to this whole discussion around rewilding, which is rewilding is really, you know, countering over domesticity. So we're looking at ways to kind of to come back into a more intimate, more original relationship with the earth. And food, of course, is such an immediate, powerful way to do that. And there's that challenge of living in a city, and people have different food growing capacities. So if we can't grow our food, luckily I do grow some of my food, but foraging is a really easy and accessible and fun way to connect with the land in the city. Mm-hmm. It's easier than going bush in foraging because there's so many different environments here of natives and non-native kind of food species, and there's just food abundant in the city.
Yeah. What kind of your favourite foods to forage for?
Well, I was just going to say, one of the kind of, we put this to the test. I don't know if you've read the last kind of chapter of my book, but in the first lockdown, when it lifted last year, my friend and I decided we'd do what we call the Hunter Gardeners Challenge, which was eating only for a week, eating only what we grew or foraged or bartered from friends from other grown and foraged food. And it was such a powerful experience in how abundant the city is. We ate really well for that week. Mm. And we ate such a variety of foods, including like currajong seeds from up the road and garden snails and all sorts of food. But one of the really interesting things for me was how much more food I noticed because I had this particular commitment. So my loop walks that I go on, I was suddenly seeing more food, foraged food, like kangaroo apples and like potatoes in an old abandoned garden, things that I might usually miss that I now saw with these eyes of like, I need to eat from my landscape. But the beautiful part about that week was how many people it put us in contact with, because we put the call out over Facebook, you know, where anything you've grown that you have abundance of, we're happy to barter for it, to exchange. And so it sent us off on our bikes around the city, and we were grinding up acorns and collecting, rhubarb and radish and fruit from people's gardens. And Melbourne specialises in there's lots of figs and locusts and olives, And of course, we'd also put our attention into kind of into preserving a lot of food leading up to this challenge. So it really was this sense of like each meal was a celebration of the land. So the huge oak tree that grows down the road from me was the source of our acorn pancakes, now acorn breads, and it was really a celebration.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. I wonder what you've noticed over the last 18 months or so around food and in the city. I mean, it's been a massive shift that I've noticed, but excuse me, I'm thinking, like you've been in lockdown for most of that time.
Yeah.
What have you noticed about the shift in relationship that people have with their food and their willingness to connect in this way or to grow more?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's such a strange time, such a rarefied time. Melbourne has been in lockdown cumulatively for over a year, which is so unheard of, like to be only able to go a 5-kilometre radius and only be in a house with your household. It's so sharply and sometimes painfully put the focus back on the local, the street, the backyard. And something that's been really beautiful is the kind of the neighbourhood feeling that's sprung up in the street that I live on. There was just this kind of more kind of openness and conversations that started happening on the street. Everyone was out walking. Everyone was talking. We were meeting neighbours that we hadn't met in years. And one of my neighbours up the street, a kind of an older retired couple who basically converted their whole property into like a permaculture farm. We started doing a lot more kind of seed swapping and resource swapping and talking over the fence and helping each other out, which has been really beautiful. And our local farmers market became, one of the kind of the few connective points of meeting up with community, like the food gathering, whether it was from gardens or shops, was the only place that we could connect outside the home. And so they've become really kind of vital kind of community markets. And yeah, I think we're all feeling a sense of deep gratitude for these kind of farmers markets now. But it's certainly been, I've had so many more communications with people over the last 18 months who are learning to kind of put their roots down where they are, rather than kind of go outside the city for their nature fix. They're really learning to find it where they are. And that's been one of the beauties, is really putting our focus on local, very, very, very local.
Yeah. And that's beautiful how you described it, how the food being such a central point of that connection, both with the natural world that you're dwelling within, but also with your community and reconnecting with the community. Yes. And you mentioned the couple up the road who do permaculture. Just maybe as a sort of a closing reflection, where do you see, or how do you see that interconnection between permaculture and rewilding? How does that look and feel for you?
Absolutely. There's such a synthesis for me between permaculture and rewilding. Rewilding is not what some people think it is, which is about just completely turning our back on anything kind of cultivated or domestic. It's really about asking the question, what connects me and what disconnects me? What makes me feel more alive? What cultivates more of a sense of relationship between my life support systems? Where can I get more immediate with my relationship with my food, my water, my shelter, my fire, my power? And so permaculture in that way is such a natural part of rewilding. It's because the permaculture, as I understand it, is about really engaging with our food growing systems, our life support systems in a kind of regenerative design. And rewilding definitely has that sense of kind of caretaking the earth and taking responsibility for our needs, our life support systems. And I guess rewilding kind of also takes it beyond the zone, the last zone of permaculture, and really looks at our kind of longer, deeper relationships with the more than human world. And it feels like just such a natural marriage, I guess, such a natural.
In a way too, I think, it is sort of the zone 5 in permaculture is that wilderness zone. And it just, the whole idea is that you try and sort of compress your footprint so that there's more space for a while, but also not just keeping it out there. It's like bringing it in, like what you're saying. It's like bring it right in every single zone. It's not like, okay, well, here's the human bit. It's like, how can we be more human in a space that is also a wild space? And, how can the garden be more of a wild garden? How can you rewild it, create a forage garden, and the orchard not being an orchard, but a food forest? And, the whole thing is, from my perspective, I think, a beautiful weaving and a beautiful way to connect. And, I think it's wonderful.
Absolutely.
How do people find your book? What are the links that we need to let people know in the show notes below?
You can go to my website, which is naturesapprentice.com.au, and you'll find the links there. It's also in all the bookshops and online, Booktopia and etc. So it should be easy to find. If you're not in lockdown, you can head to your local bookshop and support an independent bookseller.
Yeah, fantastic. And I love the concept of being a nature's apprentice to nature. And I think I was just talking to David Holmgren recently about the reading landscape, and asking questions like how to become so deeply connected that those observations just a natural way of seeing and being in the world. And it's a practice. It's the same kind of terminology that you've used, and I think it's beautiful and it's calming, and it kind of feels like the sort of thing that we need now, particularly as we're facing climate crisis, extinction crisis, to develop these skills, these capacities, these connections, relationships, community, and I guess resilience as well. All those things all together, and in a beautiful way.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, rewilding for me, like permaculture, feels like such a holistic system of cultural regeneration. It's bringing back the old ways and synthesizing them with the new. So what are the kind of rites of passage that we need for our youth? How do we mark the transitions in life? How do we kind of caretake our human communities and our non-human communities? And feels very much in alignment with what I know you're doing there, Morag. So it's been, really great to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time. It's just been wonderful. And I, when you speak to someone and it makes sense and you feel like calm, like you get tingles. I feel much calmer now than I was when I started speaking. She said, "Thank you." It's like
that's the best feedback ever. So, such a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Pleasure.
So that's all for today. Thanks so much for joining me. If you like a copy of my top 10 books to read, click the link below, pop in your email, and I'll send it straight to you. You can also watch this interview over on my YouTube channel. I'll put the link below as well. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and if you've enjoyed it, please consider giving me a star rating. Believe it or not, the more people do this, the more podcast bots will discover this little podcast. So thanks again, and I'll see you again next week.